Welcome to the special bonus episode of Ozymandias Ramses II. This is part 2 of our discussion / debate, kind of, on the nature of reality and the burden of proof. If you want to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/right. To those of you that already do, thank you. It is because of you that I am able to do this, and it is because of you that the rest of the listeners are able to participate in this epistemological movement of reason that we're all having. I'm your host, Robert Stanley, and this is part 2, Do Atheists Have the Burden of Proof, with Ozymandias Ramses II. You said you were an atheist, and I kind of wanted to ask you about this because I have been following your career for some time, and so you tend to bump heads with a lot of other prominent atheists, and it seems to be over the topic of whether or not we can call ourselves agnostic atheists. Lots of times whenever I'm speaking to a believer, they'll say, well, you know, if you're an atheist, prove there's no God. I said, well, you have the burden of proof, sir. I do not. I'm actually an agnostic atheist because I don't have knowledge, gnosis, Gnostic. I am agnostic, so I admit that I don't have the knowledge, and I am atheist, no theism, theism being the belief in God, therefore I lack a belief. And you actually have an interesting term for this, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment earlier, and thank you for inviting me. It's quite an honor, actually, to appear on this. I've been listening to your podcast for a while, and I'm sort of flattered to be invited and be in the company of some of your guests. I coined a term of 2014. I coined a term called lack theism. I'm an atheist, and that is to say, I think that there aren't any gods. I don't purport to know that there are no gods. I mean, I think some gods are completely out of the question. I think that the Abrahamic gods are out of the question. Those are ridiculous. I think those are falsified gods already. And then you've got sort of, gods of, various mythologies like Norse mythology, Greek mythology. I think those are off the table as well. Those are fairly fanciful and ridiculous. And then there are other gods that I think are a little harder to just dismiss and disprove. Conceptions of deism, for instance, right? Those are more rarefied, abstract gods, sometimes called the god of the philosophers. And I think that kind of a god, a deistic conception of God, I don't think that exists either. But that would be harder to argue against. But I'm an atheist in the sense that I don't think that there are any gods. I don't simply lack a belief in gods. I actually think that they don't exist. I'm prepared to say they don't exist. Now, I can't demonstrate and prove that no such gods exist. I think some I could demonstrate don't exist, but others I don't. It'd be very hard to do that, right? And I approach the term and the concept of atheism from philosophy. That's my background, and atheism has traditionally been understood as a theological position, right? It means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God, not a mere absence of belief. So, for instance, a newborn child doesn't have a belief in any God, presumably, right? Unless the Calvinists are right, and that we're born with a sensus divinitatis. Children presumably lack a belief in any and all gods until they have that idea pickled into them. And there are there's at least one culture out there that has not been contaminated with the God concept. So there are people who've never heard of a God in the world. And then there are people who are sort of undecided. They're on the fence. They don't know if there's a God or not. And by don't know, what I mean is they're just undecided. I don't mean that they lack knowledge. I mean, they think maybe yes, maybe no. Now that's very different from me, who thinks, that gods are just BS. Those are just human inventions, right? Those are all non-theists that I just described. I'm a non-theist. Aaron Ra, who thinks gods are bullshit, is a non-theist, right? But he's not just a non-theist. He and I are non-theists, just like babies are non-theists and agnostics are non-theists. But Aaron Ra and myself, we think gods are bullshit. We think gods are human inventions, right? And nothing more, right? Well, that's what atheism is not merely a lack of a belief, but in addition, it's thinking that gods are made up. Gods are false, right? So, for instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines atheism as the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God, right? The Oxford English Dictionary defines atheism as the belief that God does not exist. Now, these are claims about reality. When you say that a God doesn't exist, you're not purporting it in the same breath to say that you can demonstrate it, right? I mean, I think Bigfoot doesn't exist, but I don't think I can demonstrate conclusively, to a certitude that Bigfoot doesn't exist. But I have reasons for thinking that Bigfoot is just an invention and doesn't exist. I would point to all kinds of things. The lack of evidence where such evidence ought to be found, the fact that people are prone to invent things like Bigfoot and all kinds of fantastical creatures, from unicorns to dragons to, whatever else. So I have reason for thinking that Bigfoot doesn't exist, but I can't prove conclusively and absolutely that Bigfoot doesn't exist. But I don't need to, right? I'm an atheist, so to speak, with respect to Bigfoot. And I'm an atheist with respect to Yahweh and all of the gods from all of the pantheons, including deism. So in my view, atheism is best understood and has traditionally been defined as an actual positive claim about reality, the claim that gods don't exist. And where I sometimes bump heads with other atheists is, well, these are primarily atheist activists who favor a definition of atheism that is negative, that is the mere lack of a belief, so that all non-theists get lumped under the heading of atheism. In fact, what a lot of activists mean when they say atheist is what they actually mean is a non-theist, right? And I think we have the word non-theism for a reason. Non-theism is the umbrella term that captures people like me who think there isn't a God, but also captures people like agnostics who are completely undecided and can't make up their mind whether there's God or not. It captures newborn children. It captures people who've never heard of a God from another culture, for instance. So I coined this term Yeah, go ahead.
So I just want to stop you there, 'cause I feel like you and I, as we'd mentioned earlier, big fans of Mill, utilitarianism, that sort of thing. And I wonder, and just the way you said with philosophy, you were saying we need to pick out different parts from each and I wonder if we can pick that out of Mill for a second and say, okay, what is the utility of accepting the term atheism is the assertion that there is no God? It seems so useful to, and maybe I'm kind of playing semantics a little bit here, but it just seems useful in discourse, and I can vouch for this from my own personal experience. It seems useful in discourse to say atheism is a lack of belief in gods, and therefore I don't have the burden of proof. And anytime I have thrown this at a believer, they have folded. They have to go to somewhere else. They can't just keep attacking me because I say, well, I can't prove a negative, right? So it seems like a very useful method, whether or not, you're saying, well, is it really accurate in the true sense of the meaning of the word? Could we at least agree that it has utility?
Well, both definitions of atheism have some utility. So there's the more traditional standard definition of atheism as the assertion that gods don't exist. And then there's sort of the online activist definition, which is the umbrella term for all non-theists, right? And I sometimes call that lack theism.
Right.
That's the term you were talking about earlier that I coined. But they both have utility, but the utility that you're pointing to, I think, is actually a mistaken utility. See, if a person says to me, "Hey, Ozzy, what's your position on the existence of God's existence? On the question of God's existence, what's your position?" And if I said, "Well, I lack a belief in God's existence," that would be true. I do, in fact, lack a belief in God's existence. But that wouldn't be actually telling the person my position, because an agnostic, a person who's undecided, also lacks a belief. A newborn baby who's never heard of a God, or a person from another culture where God talk has never been heard, also lacks a belief, right? My cat lacks a belief. The potted plants lack a belief. The difficulty with defining myself as an atheist, and by atheism meaning merely lack theism or lacking theism, is that it doesn't tell you what my position is. My position is what I think your position is, and I know it's what Aaron Ra and Matt Dillahunty think. It's the position that gods are bullshit. That's my position. Oh, but wait a minute. That's different from an agnostic who doesn't think that gods are bullshit. An agnostic is someone who thinks maybe there's a God, right? Whereas when he says,
wouldn't he be an agnostic theist?
No, because he doesn't believe there's a God either. An agnostic is someone who's undecided, right? Like, consider like Matt Dillahunty's jelly bean example. Imagine you got a jar of jelly beans, and there's some positive number of jelly beans in there. Okay, let's say there's a bunch of them, right? And I ask you, how many are there? And you don't know. And I say, okay, well, look, you don't know how many are in the jelly bean jar, okay? But look, it's an even number or an odd number. Are you an evenist or an oddist? Now, supposing I said to you, listen, I don't want any guff. I don't want you to tell me that you're agnostic here. I want to know, are you an evenist or an oddist? It's got to be one or the other. Well, you'd think, well, geez, Ozzy, that's stupid. I don't know if it's even or odd, and I'm undecided. I know it's got to be one or the other. Look, there's either a God or there isn't a God. There's either an even number or an odd number of jelly beans, but I don't know which it is. Right? An agnostic is like someone who looks at the jelly bean jar and goes, I don't have enough to go on, and so I can't make up my mind. I neither believe it is odd, nor do I believe it is even though I know it has to be one or the other. It can't be both, and it can't be neither, but I can't decide which it is. And that's not my position with respect to God. An agnostic is someone who says, you know what? I don't know if a God exists or not. Maybe yes, maybe no. When they say I don't know, they're not saying they lack knowledge. What they're saying is I'm undecided. Right?
Aren't we trying to address two prongs of an argument simultaneously? And that's the problem from the onset with the jelly bean example. Mm-hmm. If you're saying, are you an evenist or an oddist? The question has a flaw in it immediately. Because,
yeah, it assumes that you have a position when you
right,
not.
But it also is asking you to attack two horns at the same time when it would only really be appropriate, I would think, to say, are you an evenist or not?
Okay, but now notice.
Are you an oddist or not?
Right.
If you say, are you an evenist or an oddist, that's saying let's do both. And I think that's the problem with theism, atheism, is it's saying let's attack two horns instead of attacking one. Either God exists or God does not exist, right? So therefore, either I believe that God exists or I do not believe God exists.
Right.
And in that sense, I feel like the burden of proof argument has a lot of utility because it's attacking just one horn of the argument instead of two.
Okay, there's a couple of things going on there. With respect to you're either an evenist or an oddist, why are we focusing on whether you're an evenist or an oddist? Why are we not why are we saying you're either an evenist or not an evenist? We could just as easily say, are you an oddist or a non-oddist? Right? It doesn't matter which way you go. If a person wants to know what your position is on the question of God's existence, they want to know what your position is. They don't want to know what your position isn't. Imagine if I walked up to you and I wanted to have a conversation about God's existence, and you said, well, Ozzy, what's your position? And I said, I'm a non-agnostic. And you go, well, yeah, okay. So you're not agnostic. What is it are you not agnostic about exactly? What is it you think you know here, like that God exists or that God doesn't exist?
You,
so no,
if
I'm
you
not
know
telling
or
you,
not.
Look, you're either an agnostic or you're not, right? Now, when I say I'm a non-agnostic, supposing I said that, you're left scratching your head, right? So on the question of God's existence, there are many different positions. Traditionally, we would sort of cash them out this way. There are theists. Theists are people who think there's a God. Atheists are people who think there's no God. Agnostics are people who are, like the jelly bean example, undecided. It's not that they're lacking knowledge, it's that they're undecided. They're inconclusive, okay? Whereas I've concluded, right? And a theist has come to the opposite conclusion. An agnostic is someone who's come to no conclusion. There's another position, the position known as theological non-cognitivism, or sometimes called igtheism. The igtheist, or the theological non-cognitivist, is someone who thinks that all God talk is incoherent and just basically word salad. It's all meaningless talk. The discourse is so polluted with bafflegab that it literally means nothing. And
that's interesting.
And this is the position that says that the concept of God is so incoherent that it doesn't even make sense to say, is it true or false? Right. So the question.
I've actually heard people on both sides of that argument make that claim before. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Like it's like a third category.
Well, I would say it's a fourth one. Those people aren't even agnostics. A theological non-cognitivist is someone who would say, look, the question, does God exist, isn't a question. It sounds like a question, but it's really like asking, what's the difference between a duck? That's not a proper question. The concept of God is so incoherent that it can't even get as far as being false, much less being true. And you can't be undecided about it because you're not making any sense. So the theological non-cognitivist is not an atheist, because an atheist is someone who thinks that there isn't a God. He's not a theist, nor is he undecided, because he thinks there's nothing about which you could be undecided, right? So that's a fourth position, and there are actually other positions, right? So the way the pie has traditionally been sort of cut up in philosophical discourse on the question of God's existence is there are theists who think there's a God, there are atheists who think there's no God, there are agnostics who are undecided on the question of God's existence. These are all positions on the question of God's existence. They have nothing to do with knowledge, right? And then there are atheists or theological non-cognitivists who think that the entire question is literally meaningless. It's like talking about colorless green ideas that sleep furiously. That sounds like it's referring to something, but it actually doesn't make any sense at all. So now with respect to the issue of burden of proof, this is where I think a lot of atheist activists are making a mistake and doing a disservice to the cause of atheism. When you say, I don't have a burden of justification or burden of proof, what you're saying, presumably, as I read your words, is that the other person does. But a big mistake in these discussions is people assume that one person in a discussion has the burden of justification. But that's incorrect. If there are 5 people in a room and they're all espousing 5 different positions and they're talking about all their respective positions, there are 5 burdens of proof or 5 burdens of justification in that room, not one. It's not like tennis where there's one ball going back and forth. So if I come into a room and I'm talking to a theist and the theist says there's a God and I think, I think gods are bullshit. Well, the theist has his burden of proof. He's got to give reasons for thinking there's a God. And I have to give reasons for why I think it's bullshit, right? And I'm prepared to do that. In fact, I think the burden of justification on atheism is comparatively light compared to the burden of justification for something as metaphysically extravagant as a God, right? So I think it's actually fairly easy to discharge my burden of justification as an atheist. But to suggest that I don't have a burden of justification is a mistake. Now, if I don't tell you what my position is, if we don't talk about my position, if we're only talking about your position and you're a theist, then you're the one with the burden of justification in that conversation because we're talking about your position. But as soon as I open my yap and say, gods are made up, gods are fictions, gods are imaginary, right? Gods don't exist or anything of the sort. Well, now I'm on the hook because those are all claims about reality. Those are the claims that reality includes no gods, right? Aaron Ra, for instance, and Matt Dillahunty agree with me. Gods are made up. That's a claim about reality, and it has a burden of justification, and it's one I think that is fairly easily satisfied. But to say that only the other person, only the theist has a burden of justification is a mistake. They have their burden, and we have ours as atheists. Now, if you're an agnostic, hang on, I'll just finish it. If you're an agnostic, if you're undecided, well, you're not making the claim that probably gods don't exist or definitely gods don't exist. So you don't have to defend that claim. Nor do you have to defend the claim that there is a God, right? You just have to give reasons for why it makes sense to abstain and withhold any conclusion on the matter, right? Perhaps you think that there are, weak arguments on both sides. I mean, most agnostics are agnostic because they've heard some arguments for and against God, and they go, they're all kind of weak. It's like believing whether or not there's, extraterrestrial life out there. There's arguments for it and there's arguments against it, and none of them are particularly convincing, so maybe it makes sense to be agnostic about that, even though most people take a side, right? So the question of burden of proof or burden of justification, I think is something that we in the atheist community often get wrong. We often insist that the theist has the burden of justification. No, the theist has the theist's burden of justification. But if you're the kind of non-theist that goes around saying that gods are bullshit, well, now you've taken on a burden because you have said that reality includes no gods. That is implied by the claim or the belief that gods are imaginary. And it's what you think is the case that defines your burden. It's not the name of your position. It doesn't matter if you call yourself an atheist or a non-theist or a lack-theist or an agnostic theist or an agnostic atheist. Look, it's what you think about reality. It's what you think is the case. That's what defines the burden of justification. Because the burden of proof or burden of justification is the burden of justifying or proving what you take to be the case. And if you, Robert, like me, think gods are made up, you have to have reasons for thinking that gods are made up. I'm sure you do. In fact, I've heard you espouse some of them before.
Of course. It's just that I was about to say, when you said, let me fit it, I was about to say, but Ozzy, there's a flaw in your logic. And then after you stopped me, I thought, God, I'm glad I didn't say that, because that's the last. I don't want, just for the record, folks, you don't want to just say, Ozzy, there's a flaw in your logic, because you'll probably get embarrassed immediately thereafter, as many have. Check out his YouTube channel, you'll see for yourself. But anyway, I think there's humbly, respectfully, Mr. Ramses II, I think there's a flaw in your logic.
Sure.
And here's where it is. It reminds me of, you and I have both bumped heads with Blake Juta before, wonderful guy. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, Robert, what are your reasons? Because he was trying to use that percentage thing, kind of like Anthony Magnabosco does with the street epistemology.
Right.
But he uses that style of percentages from a theistic perspective, right? And he says, what percentage are you at now? And then tell me why you think there are no gods, and then I'll beat up those ideas a little bit, punch them a couple times in a boxing ring, and then we'll see what your percentage is thereafter, right? If it's lowered at all. So he was throwing this at me, and I said, well, here's the problem with that. Anything that I say that would be a refutation of God or gods would simply be refuting something that you give me as representing theism, right? So in the same sense of, like when you said, okay, everybody's born a non-theist. Mm-hmm. We're all non-theist little babies, right? In that same way, I was trying to explain to him, I didn't have this God concept. It's just that I was told that there is this Augustinian style greatest great or goodest good or what have you. You know, there's this omniscience, omnipresence, omnibenevolent, omnipotent. These kinds of concepts didn't even exist before, right? It's like they're trying to use this kind of weak sauce theory of forms at me as I'm getting older and growing up in the church. And then as I start to get to this point of reasoning through these bad arguments, it's not that I got this great additional piece of information as to why there are no gods. It's just that every claim that they made about there being gods started to fall apart because their logic would contradict itself in this area, or I would learn something about empirical science that I could hold in my hand and look at or do the math with and say, okay, that was false because of the, very, very significant reasons to refute the claims that they made for their positive claim of a God. And that was my rebuttal to Blake. And I kind of want to use that as a rebuttal to you in the sense of, if I do take the positive claim that there are no gods, the only thing that I can offer are to refute the made-up version of whatever God someone is claiming there is. And that, to me, that's not really much of a stance as it is a rebuttal. And in the same way, if I were to ask you, if I think of your name, Ozymandias Ramses II, all right, so I just take the reverse of Ramses, I say Sesmar. Mm-hmm. Prove to me that Sesmar doesn't exist. You're an asethmarist. Mm-hmm. Show me that Sesmar doesn't exist. Well, immediately you would say, well, what's that? Okay, as soon as I tell you, well, Sesmar wears a green jacket. Sesmar plays a lot of golf. He won that jacket from winning a couple rounds of golf. The story keeps going on and on and on until I present a flaw in my representation of Sesmar. You have nothing to say about it, right? In that same way, couldn't we say that maybe burden of proof is the wrong way to characterize it? Maybe I kind of like your what would you call it? Burden of
justification. Well, they're the same thing.
I like that.
That's a really good point you're drawing out there. Okay, first of all, we have this expression in English, burden of proof, and it's an unfortunate one. It's a translation of a Latin expression that's used in law and in philosophy, and it's onus probandum. It's the onus for proving something is on this person or that person. Everyone has their own onus probandum for their position, whatever their position is. But the problem is we've translated onus probandum into burden of proof. Okay, and when people hear proof, they immediately, their mind goes to something like a geometric proof or a strict deductive or mathematical proof, right? An absolutely conclusive proof, right? But the word,
I go to alcohol, but I have a drinking problem.
So the word proof is perhaps best reserved for subjects like logic and math and geometry and set theory and other formal domains, right? I mean, when we talk about proof in court, really all we're talking about is evidence, right? All we're talking about are reasons for thinking something is true, right? So I say, well, what's your proof that so-and-so committed such and such a crime? Well, I'm not asking for something like a deductive proof or mathematical proof or something as robust as that. I'm asking you for what are the reasons for thinking that so-and-so did it that would give us enough, confidence that we could, lock the person up, right? So burden of proof is really just burden of evidence. It's burden of justification. That's all the expression means, right? But unfortunately, the word proof hangs people up. They hear the word proof and they think, wait, if I have to prove that God exists, oh my, that's really hard to do. So a lot of theists don't try to prove that God exists. They give reasons why they think a God is probable or something like that, right? And a lot of atheists think probably a God doesn't exist. I mean, I think probably no gods exist, right? I think definitely some don't, but for other gods that are more rarefied and they exist as logical possibilities, but they're pretty weak. And I can think of some weak arguments against them. So I think probably no gods of any kind exist. Okay, I can't prove it, right? But you don't have to prove when you think something is highly improbable or highly probable, right? So I think it's highly improbable that any gods exist. Okay, but I don't have a proof of that. What I have are reasons for thinking that all gods are improbable. Some of them are extremely improbable. Some are, somewhat improbable, and some of them I think are flat out impossible. But like logically incoherent conceptions of God, for instance, are completely impossible. So we can rule them out. So really what we're talking about is the burden of justifying your position. But people hear the expression burden of proof and then they kind of wet themselves. They go, wait a minute, if you're saying as an atheist, I have to take on a burden of proof, that means I got to prove that any and all gods don't exist. Well, I don't know how to do that. Well, look, you only have the burden of proving that any and all gods are impossibilities if it's your contention, if it's your belief that all gods are impossibilities. Well, look, it's not my view that all gods are impossibilities. I think that at best, they're improbable, right? And at worst, some of them are impossible, okay? But if I believe that any and all gods were impossibilities, then I would have to prove that, right? Then the burden of justifying that would be extremely high, right? But that's not my view, fortunately, right? So for someone who believes that, they do have a heavy burden of proof, right? So what you believe and the degree of confidence with what you believe it is what dictates what your burden is, right? If I think there's a car in my garage, the burden of discharging that belief is easy. Let's go into my garage, open the door, and if there's a car there, that belief that there's a car in my garage has been discharged. No problem. If I believe, or if I claim that the Batmobile is in my garage rather, not just any car, but a rather, extraordinary car, now the burden of justifying that belief is much higher, okay? Because not any car will do in my garage. It has to be a specific car, rather extraordinary car, right? And so if I believe that the universe has a cause, okay, well, I'll need a reason, an argument for why I think the universe has to have a cause. But if I think that that cause of the universe's existence is a God, well, what are you talking about? Well, if I say, God is this being that has all these omni attributes and so forth. Okay, well, now that's a really metaphysically extravagant being. Now the burden of justification is extremely high. Okay, so as I see it, atheists shouldn't get hung up on the expression burden of proof. It just means the burden of justifying your position. And if your position is that there aren't any gods, then the burden of justifying your atheism is giving reasons why you think there aren't any gods. And almost all atheists have reasons for thinking that there aren't any gods. That's why they call themselves atheists, as opposed to, they think of themselves as undecided, right? With respect to the other part of your question about the strategy you adopted when talking to Blake Junta, what you're pointing out there is that the conception of God that he's putting forward wouldn't have occurred to you except that people have put it forward to you, right? I mean, you start off as a non-theist, as an infant, and at some point people start with the God talk and they start pickling in this concept into you. And then, someone says, well, why don't you believe in a God? And of course, one's reaction is, well, what on earth would have occasioned me to think there was a God in the first place, except that you brought it up, right? But it doesn't matter what another person thinks, okay? The other person doesn't need to exist. I don't need a theist in the room for me to think that gods are bullshit. Yes, it's true. The concept of God never would have occurred to me, okay, if there hadn't been a theist in the room. But the point is, I have heard the claim that there exists an eternal being, timelessly eternal, who created all of physical reality around us, that has all these attributes. Well, I have reasons for thinking that that doesn't exist. And I don't need a theist in the room to have that burden. If it is my belief that that thing doesn't exist, it doesn't matter how I acquired the belief. It doesn't matter that someone pickled that belief into me as an infant, okay? The point is, I have heard this concept, and I have a reason for thinking that it's bullshit, just like I have a reason for thinking that Bigfoot is bullshit, right? And I think I have really good reasons for thinking that Bigfoot is just a fantasy. It's just made up, right? I have reasons for thinking that all of the arguments and putative evidence and blurry photographs and grainy footage and cast footprints and all of that these are hoaxes. I have ways of undermining this putative evidence in favor of Bigfoot. And similarly, I have ways of arguing against, the so-called proofs of God and the evidence that's put forward in favor of God in the form of answered prayer and personal experience and stuff like that. I have reasons for thinking, for undermining all of those reasons and arguments, right? That's part of discharging my burden of justification. Most atheists, in fact, when they're arguing with theists, do exactly that. Most atheists, when they go around knocking down the reasons that theists put up for their theism, are in fact in the process of discharging the burden of justification for their atheism. That's what they're doing. But they've been told you don't have a burden of justification. And so they then, in one breath, they're demolishing the theistic arguments and theistic evidence. They're giving reasons for thinking that they're completely made up. I mean, look at all the other religions. Christianity doesn't stand out among other religions. It sounds just as fabulous as Islam and Judaism and Mithraism and Shintoism and all the rest of it. They all sound equally fantastical. Okay, they all sound equally made up. Right? That's a reason for thinking that it's made up. Right? There it is. You're discharging the burden of your atheism right then and there. So most atheists are actually quite adept at doing this, but they have been told that they don't have a burden of justification. Now, part of the reason why there's all this talk about burden of justification is that so many theists want to start with, if you think there's no God, you have to prove there's no God, right? Now, of course, proving there's no God is hard, just like proving there is a God is hard, right? Proving there's no Bigfoot is hard, right? But you don't need to prove there's no God. You just have to have good reasons for thinking that there's no God and that God is a fiction and imaginary, right? So the fact that we want to hold theists' feet to the fire and make them give us reasons for their theism, okay, doesn't let us off the hook, right? They have their burden and we have ours. They've got a really heavy burden. I think we have a comparatively light burden, right? And we shouldn't be afraid to admit that we have a burden of justification. In my experience, when I talk to theists and I give reasons why I think there's no God, right? They don't find them entirely convincing, but they at least think, okay, well, he at least didn't run away from his atheism, okay? But a lot of theists hear atheists say, only theists have a burden of justification. Atheists don't have a burden of justification. And I think that makes us sound weak. A lot of theists, in my experience, think that atheists look and sound weak because in one breath they say things that absolutely imply that reality includes no gods when they say things like gods are made up, gods are imaginary. And then in the next breath, they run away from trying to support that claim by insisting that the other person, the theist, defend their theism. Look, let the theist defend their theism. I think they've got enough on their plate already. There's no reason why you shouldn't defend your theism. I think they have an insurmountable task, okay? Whereas it is no harder to argue against a god than to argue against Bigfoot, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways of arguing against God's existence, okay? Sometimes the God that they posit has contradictory attributes. The God is completely incoherent. Some of these omni attributes, and depending on how you define them, they just don't cohere. They're incoherent, right? They're positing an inconsistent God, right? Sometimes the God that they're positing is contradicted by certain facts. They say, God is all good. Well, if he's all good and he's omnipotent and he has all these omni attributes, why is there any evil or suffering in the world? And then they have to make up some specious ad hoc motive for why there would be evil and pain and suffering and misery in the world, right? Look, this all smacks of ad hoc reasoning. These are not difficult arguments to dismantle, right? So there's a case of not just of an inconsistent God, but a God that is inconsistent with certain facts. So that's an external contradiction. It's not an internal contradiction. It contradicts certain external states of affairs. Okay. Then there's the absence of evidence, and people say, well, wait, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Bullshit. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It's not proof of absence, but it's evidence of absence. What else but an absence of evidence could be the evidence of something being absent, right? Right? And in the case of God and Bigfoot, you can point to the fact that Bigfoot, if Bigfoot existed, there are certain facts that we would expect to find, right? We would expect to find a skeleton by now. We would expect to find perhaps a living specimen. We have trail cams all over the place. We should find stools and things like that, and hair and DNA samples. And I mean, by now we should have found a living or dead specimen. So what we have here is a case of the absence of evidence where evidence is expected to be found and then not finding it. That's evidence of absence. When you look for evidence that should be there, given what the thing that you're talking about, and that evidence isn't there, that's evidence that the thing isn't there. Okay, so it's absolutely false when people say absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Yes, it is, especially when the evidence is predicted. When evidence should be there that isn't there, that's evidence of absence. Well, that's exactly the case in the case of God, right? There's all kinds of things that we should expect to find. We haven't found an ark. We haven't found a 6,000-year-old earth. We haven't found evidence of a global flood and so forth, right? So, Yahweh and that entire set of religions, those Abrahamic faiths, they're all refuted, in my view, by the absence of evidence that we ought to find. So most atheists are familiar with a lot of these arguments, and they put them forward, but they don't realize that when they're doing that, they are discharging their burden of justification, right? It's not that heavy a burden to shoulder, right? Most atheists are, in fact, doing it all the time in their discussions and arguments with theists, but they've been told that in order to get the theist to shoulder his burden, they should be running away from their own and denying that they have one. And that's a mistake. And so this is why I think that defining atheism as the mere lack of a belief is inadvisable, because and it's because of this concept of burden of justification. If in your heart of hearts you think gods don't exist, that's your position. That's the position you need to defend. And pretending that your position is the same as the position of someone who's undecided, such as an agnostic, or that your position is the same as a theological non-cognitivist who thinks that the concept is incoherent and that the God question has no true or false answer at all, or that you are the same as a newborn baby or someone who's never heard of a God, right? These are all different positions, right? Those people all have different belief states than the person who, like you and me, thinks gods are made up. When you define your position as a non-position, as an umbrella term, you're not answering the question, what is your position, right? So defining your position as a non-position to get out of the burden of justification, I think, is an illegitimate move. It's burden shifting, right? They have their burden, we have ours. Let them take on theirs. And the fact that you admit that you have a burden of justification doesn't get them off the hook. This isn't tennis with one ball going back and forth over the net, okay? There are as many burdens of justification in an argument as there are positions in the argument, right? So if there are two people arguing two different positions, right, each have their own, there are two burdens of justification. If there are three people arguing their three respective positions, then there are three burdens of justification. And this is just a matter of simple logic, because what dictates what your burden of justification is, if any, is the position that you take to be true. Now, in any given conversation, you don't have to be having two conversations at once. You don't have to be discussing their position and yours. If they walk into the room and they say, God exists, and you go, really, why is that? And you haven't stated what your position is, there's no reason why you have to defend your atheism, because you're talking about their theism. But if in the course of the discussion your atheism comes up, they're entitled to say, well, wait a minute, why are you an atheist? And then what you do is you say, I'm prepared to defend my atheism, but that doesn't get you off the hook of defending your theism. So I'm going to keep pressing you to defend your theism, and I can defend my atheism if you like. And we can have those two conversations simultaneously. It's best if we concentrate on one or the other. But it's unfair to insist that automatically you don't have a burden of justification just because you identify as an atheist, and the definition of atheist that you're using is a non-position, an umbrella of many different positions, each of which has its own burden of justification, and then trying to pretend that you don't have a burden of justification. And that is why I coined this term lack theism. There's a lot of atheists out there who, in fact, are atheists in the strong sense of the word, in the sense of thinking that there aren't any gods. Not necessarily believing that it's provable, but we think probably there aren't any gods, who run away from discharging their burden of justification and insist that atheism means a mere lack of belief. It doesn't matter how we define atheism. What matters is your position. And if your position is probably there's no God or definitely there's no God, then that's the burden of justification that you have to discharge.
Listening to you talk, it's kind of reminiscent of the old Carl Sagan extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that. For now, I guess we'll have to disagree on, maybe it's just, I think we just disagree on some semantics, really. But either way, so I'm going to have to charge up and get ready for the next time if we can have you back on, and I'll try and hit you again with some new stuff and see if I can't tackle these arguments that you're presenting. But I really enjoyed listening to you, and I could listen to you all day, but I don't want to take too much of your time. I know you're a busy guy. One more time, how can people find you, and if they wanted to contact you on the social medias or anything like that? Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for those kind words, and I'd be very happy to talk to you again. As to where to find me, I have a YouTube channel. It's called Ozymandias Ramses II. I have a G+ page, so if you use Google+, you can find me there, Ozymandias Ramses II. And I have a Facebook page as well. You can friend me on Facebook, Ozymandias Ramses II.
That was really great. Do check out his YouTube channel. It will challenge your brain, and you'll come away with a clear understanding of why we think the way we think, and maybe what we should rethink, too. Music is from aloststateofmind.com. You can find us at therighttoreason.com and support us at patreon.com/right. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. Don't forget that you, too, have the right to reason.